Boa noite a todos, sejam bem-vindos ao nosso primeiro webinar para o mercado de bovinos. Meu nome é Fábio Savoldi, eu sou o diretor de negócios da Nexo Agro e nós somos os responsáveis por esse evento. E desculpa, tecnologias. Eu queria iniciar com vocês fazendo uma breve introdução sobre o objetivo do webinar e também falando um pouquinho sobre quem somos e mais ou menos como será o fluxo desse webinar. Nós somos da Anexo Agro. A Anexo Agro é uma empresa brasileira que atua no segmento de soluções naturais para a saúde e nutrição animal. Nosso principal objetivo é trazer parceiros globais que queiram participar do mercado brasileiro e nós os representamos e distribuímos aqui no mercado, dando toda a estrutura da parte de serviços técnicos, venda, regulatório e atuando nos segmentos. Inicialmente, começamos a trabalhar nos segmentos de aves e suínos há 2 anos e meio atrás e agora estamos iniciando a nossa jornada dentro do segmento de bovinos. Nesse segmento, a gente tem a felicidade e o prazer de trazer um parceiro que é a Nuance Technologies, que é uma empresa suíça e que traz dentro do seu portfólio diferentes soluções naturais, desde produtos como butiratos e outras soluções e absorventes de micotoxinas, como também um conceito novo que é o posbiótico. E esse é o tema da nossa apresentação, da nossa conversa aqui com vocês. A nossa apresentação hoje será sobre a melhor saúde intestinal para melhores resultados, como o posbiótico pode impulsionar a produção leiteira. Essa apresentação vai ser feita, na verdade, já foi uma apresentação já gravada em inglês e já está toda com o subtítulo, com as legendas em português, para facilitar o entendimento de todos vocês. Ela foi feita pelo David Harrington, que é o diretor de gestão de produtos da Nuance. O David, ele tem mais de 25 anos dentro desse segmento de soluções naturais, posbióticos, probióticos, então ele tem uma vivência muito grande nesse mercado. Ele se disponibilizou a fazer essa participação aqui com a gente e ele estará no final da apresentação. Então, no final da apresentação gravada, ele se juntará a gente aqui para uma sessão de perguntas e respostas. Então, ao final, a gente vai ter uma sessão de perguntas e respostas ao vivo com o próprio David, e aí eu vou me responsabilizar por fazer a tradução do conteúdo e da apresentação. Tá ok? Então, eu queria, sem mais demora, pedir para que a gente inicie com a apresentação do David, e a partir daí a gente vai avançando e vai para a sessão de perguntas e respostas. Um detalhe com relação a perguntas: se você tiver alguma pergunta, se tiver interesse de fazer a pergunta, use o nosso chat que tem lá no YouTube. Você coloca a pergunta lá e nós vamos poder acessá-la e fazer para o David ao final da sessão, tá ok? Espero que todos desfrutem do conteúdo. Acho que a gente se esforçou para trazer uma informação nova e que aproveitem as informações e que possamos este ser o pontapé inicial de vários outros eventos que nós, da Nexo, junto com a Nuance e outros parceiros, iniciaremos aí na pecuária de leite brasileira, tá ok? Então, vamos iniciar com a apresentação do David.
Hello, I'm Dave Harrington. I'm the Chief Product Officer, Director of Product Management for Nuance Biotechnology. And today we're going to have a look at postbiotics on the theme of enhancing dairy production. So looking at better gut health for better returns. And I thought when we'd look at the presentation for the next kind of 50, 60 minutes, we'd really break it down into 6 sections. First, we'll look at some of the challenges in modern livestock production, have a quick look at milk production kind of globally and in Brazil. Then we can have a look at the world of biotics. What do we mean by biotics? What are they? And then specifically, we're going to look at bacterial postbiotics in rumen gut health. And then we'll move on from kind of looking at what they do to looking at a specific product, Bust, as a proprietary bacterial postbiotic, looking at some of the field experience of that. And then we'll circle back onto the role of postbiotics and how they can help us maybe in sustainable production, coming back to kind of one of the challenges of modern livestock production. And then just summing it up with a slide or two of conclusions and summary. So I think, you know, when we talk about the challenges in modern livestock production, modern dairy production, they're numerous. But if we take a step back and just look at kind of where we are with milk production globally, I thought I'd take a quick snapshot of really the last kind of 10 years, just looking at how it's grown. In Asia, back in 2015, Asia's doing 327 million tons, the EU, for example, 150, and Brazil down here at about 35.9, 36 million tons. If we kind of move forward 5 years, Asia's really growing. The European Union has grown a little bit. So, you know, 400 million tons. Brazil's increased a little bit, 36.7 million tons. So, you know, if we come forward another 5 years to now, this year, 2023, then, you know, Asia continues to grow. The European Union has got a little bit static, and Brazil's kind of marginal growth. But when we look at the trends of milk production, the predictions of milk production, demand is going to continue to increase globally. So we're going to have to continue to produce milk to meet that demand. Asia's going to be at the front of that. But, you know, the Brazilian market continues to grow. The US continues to grow, albeit potentially very slowly. But to meet that milk production, to kind of continue to meet that demand, certainly, you know, we currently face and we will face several hurdles, we suspect. And definitely one of those challenges is price volatility, market volatility. We've all seen it with feed prices, soybean prices everywhere. Some ingredient prices are highly variable. And actually, when I just went on and to look at the milk price, so the farm gate price, producer price for milk, when I go back 20 years, look at 2005, it was around $0.2 per liter, and it's slowly increased. It reached a peak maybe of $0.65, $0.67 per liter in 2022, 2023, but now we're seeing a real drop off on those prices. So even if feed prices manage to stabilize, we still can end up with volatility on our milk price. And I just saw when I was doing some research here that down in the south of Brazil, there's some real concerns about the collapse of that dairy industry because the milk price is dropping that much. So, you know, we start to run into the challenge of our cost of production beginning to exceed the cost that we get for our milk. So, of course, then we're in economic distress. So this price volatility around milk price, ingredient price, energy price, transport prices really are obviously quite a challenge for the industry. And I think, you know, the challenges doesn't just stop there at economics. Environmentally, we're certainly seeing an incredible effect of the environment globally. You know, we've spoken about global warming for the past 15 years or more. You know, whether it's a real effect or not. And I think, you know, when we look at the data, it certainly suggests that we're seeing more extremes of weather. These are pictures from flooding in the south of Brazil, I think, this year, where you get these extreme weather events. Obviously, flooding has an impact in terms of production, damaging building, animals. And what we also see is that the surface temperature is increasing in Brazil. So if we go back 123 years, we can see that, you know, over time, we've gone from an average surface temperature of, say, 24, maybe 0.8 degrees C. Now we're reaching an average surface temperature of 25.8 degrees C. So quite a big, you know, that 1 degree increase in surface temperature can have quite a profound effect on the environment in terms of heat stress, in terms of environmental conditions. So these extremes of the environment are something that are going to be there. We're going to have to continue to address and kind of face head on, both in terms of the damage that it does to our facilities and production, actually to the effect it can have on our animals as well. And we know that heat stress can have a very significant impact on dairy cows. So, you know, if we start to move into that temperature humidity index, that THI index, where we start to get moderate to severe, then we can start to see a reduction in dry matter intake, you know, maybe up to 30%. And that can then alter rumen fermentation patterns. That begins to alter rumination time. So then you begin to get poorer fiber digestion. As the animal gets hot, then, you know, it's trying to cope with losing heat. So there's an increase in maintenance energy requirements, maintenance demands. So that means that energy is going into trying to keep cool and therefore not going into milk production. Then we end up with compromised gut barrier function, so leaky gut. We can get systemic inflammation, elevated oxidative stress. That can again impact on our reproductive performance. So we can start to have poorer conception rates. We can see an increase in metabolic diseases. So the environmental volatility, if you like, the environmental extremes, can pose a real problem in terms of how we manage the animals, in terms of how the animals can cope with those kind of stresses. And then tied in with the environment and the environmental extremes, obviously comes the concern around sustainability and greenhouse production, because the prevailing theory goes that obviously our production of greenhouse gases are contributing to global warming, so contributing to these extremes of environment. And this is some nice work that was done by Poor and Nemsek back in 2018. And they did a big life cycle analysis of the greenhouse gas emissions across the livestock production supply chains. And you can see here they looked at beef, poultry, eggs, for some reason rice is in this one, but also cheese and milk. And you can see here that, you know, the beef production, that is by far the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So they get a bit of a bad rap in terms of their contribution to these carbon dioxide equivalents. So you convert how much methane you produce, how much ammonia is produced, etc., into these carbon dioxide equivalents, which can then feed into some of these measures of global warming. So we can see down here that actually kind of milk production, in terms of its greenhouse emissions, its footprint is actually quite small compared to beef, for example, the other ruminants, but it's still very much on the radar of regulatory control for reducing emissions, for improving the sustainability footprint. Antibiotic usage, you know, we cannot talk about the challenges for livestock production without talking about antibiotics. Some work that was just recently done where the authors looked at the current usage of antibiotics in livestock, and then they just made a prediction as business as usual. So if we carry on doing what we're doing, then we're going to see an increase of maybe 29.5, 30% of antibiotic use by 2040 compared to the baseline that they set at 2019. So, you know, this concern of antibiotic usage is driven by the concern of human health. So this increasing antimicrobial resistance. So we're running out of antibiotics that we can use. So many governments have pledged to reduce their antibiotic usage in food production systems by 30 to 50%. So this means that the tools that we have, we need to be very judicious how we use them. And what's interesting is when you look at antibiotic usage, then pigs and cattle, so pigs and large ruminants, are by far the biggest user of these antibiotics, this antimicrobial usage quantity. So, it's very much ruminant production is in the headlights, if you like, for antibiotic use, for sustainability as well. And just some other challenges that we then see are around kind of the feed challenges. So environmental variability can then have an impact on the quality of our cereals, the quality of our ingredients. So we can end up with low quality ingredients, low protein content, or inconsistent quality. Mycotoxin risk tends to be generally increasing. So, we'll start to get more cereals with aflatoxins, which are a real problem for us in terms of our milk quality. But these low quality ingredients, these feed challenges, have an impact on the rumen microbiota and the gut barrier function. So, if we sum up the challenges that are facing us in modern dairy production, volatile feed costs and dynamics, we have threats to biosecurity, which we haven't even touched on, but they're a given, the health, disease challenges that we see. And really, it's this increasing legislative control and the environmental challenge, which is also tied in with legislation. So, there's a lot of challenges that we see here. And one way we can do that is we can look to build the resilience of our animals. And resilience is the capacity of an animal to be minimally affected by disturbances. So we can try and build resilience into our livestock, for example, via genetics, via breeding. We can do it via management practices, and we can also do it via feed additives. So by giving our animals specific feed additives, we can boost the resilience of those animals to cope with some of these stresses, to cope with environmental stresses, feed challenges, and so on and so forth. So kind of one group of additives that we can use are the biotics. And I think the world of biotics, we'll go on to explain, is really around kind of three classes of compounds: probiotics, prebiotics, and postbiotics. And it's always worth going back. We're using the biotics because we're targeting, first and foremost, the microbial ecology of the gut. And just to remind ourselves, the ruminant, it has a rich population of bacteria, archaea, protozoa, and fungi. And together they're all working to degrade these complex plant fibers, driving fiber fermentation, breaking down proteins and starch, and generating short-chain fatty acids that supply up to 70% of the cow's energy requirements. So that's the engine of the animal, is the rumen. That's why we always focus on the rumen. So if we disturb that balance, if we shift it, for example, towards lactic acid bacteria that can shift the pH, so to cause an acidosis, or to endotoxin release in species, proliferate E. coli, and then we can throw out that gut balance and cause all sorts of problems. So if we can support that microbiota through the targeted use of these biotics, then we can help with the resilience, feed efficiency, and health of those animals. So as I said at the beginning, when we talk about the world of biotics, it kind of encompasses solutions that we talk about supporting and preserving the balance of the microbiota. And they generally fall into three categories. You've got your prebiotics, which think of them as kind of the substrate. So if we're growing a crop, the prebiotics are the substrate. The probiotics are the seeds. So we plant the seeds and they grow into our crop. And the postbiotics is what we harvest from the crop. And you'll see why we use these kind of categories now. So when we talk about a prebiotic is a non-digestible food ingredient that promotes the growth of beneficial intestinal microorganisms, okay? Typically, prebiotics are resistant against physical processing. You know, they're pretty inert, so they're quite compatible with other additives. You know, well-known examples: fructooligosaccharides, mannanoligosaccharides, and inulin. So they would be your prebiotics. And really, the idea behind them is to get that gut bacteria going. So they're that non-digestible feed source. So then those prebiotics can be used by bacteria for then fermentation to produce some of those short chain fatty acids that we need. They can also be used by bacteria to grow. So, you know, we'll give the prebiotics to help kickstart the gut microbiota, give those bacteria something to use to grow. And they can then have an impact on the luminal pH. So prebiotics really, like I say, are inanimate. They're just non-digestible feed stuff for the microbiota. And that's very different from a probiotic. And a probiotic is a live microorganism that, when administered in adequate amounts, confers a health benefit on the host. So typically, probiotics work via competitive exclusion and metabolite production. And depending on the species of probiotic, they can be pretty sensitive to temperature, as we'll see, as we'll chat on just in another slide. So we talk about probiotics as being the crop, because probiotics, when you put them in the animal, they work by multiplying, by growing. That's how they work. Probiotics that have been used in ruminants, there's a very long list. So you have the lactobacilli, we have the bifidobacteria, we have the bacilli, we've used fungi, we've used other bacteria as well, Prevotellus, E. coli, other lactic acid bacteria. An important distinction to remember is when you use something like a lactobacillus, often they're very sensitive. So you need to try and protect them in some way, or put them through a route where you can get them to the animal very quickly. A bacillus typically forms a spore, so it's a far more robust organism. So bacillus is something that we would commonly give in feed, for example. So that's an important distinction, because depending on the probiotic dictates its sensitivity to pH and temperature, for example, and the application. But whether it's a lactobacillus, a bacillus, or anything else, they all work in, by and large, the same way. So you'll have your probiotics, as we can see here, and typically what they'll do is after a period of time, they'll begin to grow in the gut, multiply, colonize the gut. They then can adhere to the epithelial, to the intestinal mucosa. They might promote the production of mucin, so they can enhance the epithelial barrier. What they'll typically then do is they'll competitively exclude the pathogens. So basically, it's a space. Your probiotic takes up space that then your pathogen, for example, a salmonella, cannot bind to the mucosal surface. Some probiotics might also produce anti-microorganism substances, so antimicrobial peptides, to then inhibit the growth of other pathogens. They can inhibit pathogen adhesion. So it's a very active system. As long as that probiotic is alive, it will continue to work. And then through all these actions, then they modulate the immune system. When we talk about postbiotics, they're a preparation of inanimate microorganisms and or their components, so their metabolites. So it can be metabolites, it can be cellular fractions, but typically when we're talking about a postbiotic is dead. So that's a big distinction from a probiotic. Probiotic is alive, postbiotic is dead. And typically then with a postbiotic, what you're doing is you're giving the cellular fractions, you're giving those the metabolites that would be produced by the bacteria in the gut. You're just giving them ahead of colonization, if you like. So a postbiotic still has the same effect as a probiotic. It can modulate the immune response. It can stimulate the gut barrier. It can impact the microbiome. Depending on the postbiotic, it can also inhibit the growth of other bacteria, but it does that via antimicrobial peptides, not via competitive exclusion, because a postbiotic is not taking up any space. It's not growing in the gut. So if we just try and compare the three to drill it down, you know, a prebiotic, to recap, is a non-digestible feed substrate for bacteria. Probiotics are live microorganisms. Postbiotic is inactivated microbes and their metabolites. Examples of a prebiotic are moss and phos, probiotics, Bacillus subtilis. A postbiotic could be a cell-free lactobacillus fermentate. So the main mechanism of a prebiotic is to selectively nourish beneficial microbes. Probiotics compete with pathogens and produce beneficial metabolites in situ as they grow, colonize the gut. Postbiotics deliver those metabolites directly. So in a way, you could think of the probiotic as the intermediary step to get to a postbiotic, the metabolites. Postbiotic is just cutting out the middleman, which is the bacteria. So stability in feed of prebiotics and postbiotics is excellent because there's no live microorganisms, which also means there's a very low regulatory risk. And this is very important, the speed, the onset of the effect. Postbiotics can be very quick because you're delivering metabolites in the form that they need already in the microbiota. Probiotics take time because they need to colonize the gut. And prebiotics can be pretty quick as well, but then their effect depends on how quickly those bacteria grow. And just without going into too much depth, when we talk about postbiotics, they can either be yeast, lactobacillus, or bacteria, or fungi. Okay, so a postbiotic can originate from any one of those microorganisms, but there are some pretty significant differences between metabolites, postbiotics, from yeast, from bacteria, and fungi. Number one, for example, would be those antimicrobial peptides, that bacteriocins. Yeast doesn't produce them, fungi doesn't produce them, but lactobacillus bacteria do. Another one is the actual structure, the cell wall components. Yeast, we know, beta-glucans, mannan-oligosaccharides. They've been around for a long time. Lactobacillus is typically peptidoglycan fragments, diptocheic acid. Fungi is typically chitin and glucans. And those cell wall components can have different effects on the host animal, different immune effects. Exopolysaccharides, these are soluble factors that are produced basically by bacteria, by lactobacillus, and they have a strong immunomodulatory function. You don't get those with yeast, and you get very typically low levels with fungi as well. And then they also differ in their immunomodulatory molecules, and that can then have an effect on what we see in the host. So we are going to focus on bacterial postbiotics today. So this group from the lactic acid bacteria, let's say, that's what we work with, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And just when we look more closely then at that bacterial postbiotic composition, it's a very complex mixture. And each of these kind of metabolites, these cell fractions, can have a function. So vitamins, B complex vitamins, can have a role in immunity and metabolism. Cell surface proteins, S-layer proteins, can inhibit, for example, pathogen invasion, salmonella invasion. We've already mentioned antimicrobial peptides. carbohydrates, teichoic acids, they can be antioxidant. Some of the lipids are antioxidant in activity. Some of the complex molecules, like lipoteichoic acid, is immunomodulatory. We all know about organic acids and their role as a substrate for the microbiota, propionic, butyric, lactic, acetic. And then we have enzymes. We'll have enzymes in there depending on the substrate we use. And they can be antioxidant, they can be digestive in nature, or even anti-inflammatory in nature. So bacterial postbiotics bring a number of advantages over probiotics. So, just to recap, they're safe. So there's only dead organisms in there. So there's no risk of antimicrobial resistance factors being transferred. There's no risk of reversion to virulence, which shouldn't be the case. But if you get your probiotics from unreputable companies, there's always a risk of microbial contamination. Postbiotics are compatible with many other feed additives and antibiotics. There's no live microorganisms. So your postbiotic is not going to be impacted by antibiotics. They're thermostable, and because there's no live microorganisms, they have a long shelf life. As we said before, they're fast-acting. Metabolites are readily available for use by the gut bacteria. And depending on the organism you use, the bacteria you use, and the growth conditions you use, you can tailor the metabolite profile for the solution that you're looking for. So you can end up with a targeted application that you can easily apply in feed and potentially in water. So bacterial postbiotics come with a number of interesting advantages that actually then, when we start looking at what the role they have in rumen gut health, make them very exciting. And I think, when we talk about the role of postbiotics in rumen gut health, it's always worth a recap on the importance of that rumen microflora, that gut microflora, and its importance in gut health. And this is just a small example of, if we end up with an imbalance in that rumen microflora, then we can end up with these metabolic diseases such as bloat, excess gas accumulation, such as ruminal acidosis, diarrhea, which would be a disorder of the lower GI tract. And the other thing I think is always important to highlight, in dairy, in the ruminant, we focus on the rumen because it's kind of the engine of the animal. But the rest of the gut has a microbiome, it has a microbiota. And it's vitally important also for the absorption of nutrients and homeostasis. So whilst we focus on the rumen, we cannot forget the rest of the gut and the importance it plays in gut health. And that gut and gut health is fundamental in terms of the overall function of the animal due to this microbiota gut-brain axis. The gut-brain axis has gained more and more interest as we've learned more about it. And it's this bidirectional communication between the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and intestinal function. So that gut-brain axis, that bidirectional communication, influences all physiological functions in the animal. And that gut microbiota is absolutely fundamental to the functioning of the gut, which is why we have this microbiota gut-brain axis, this three-way communication. And what we see, for example, with the brain is that if we have some intestinal upsets in our animals, we can end up with anxiety-like behaviors, stress behaviors. We can see an impact on social behavior or feeding behavior because of this two-way communication or three-way communication between the microbiota, the gut, and the brain. We know, for example, with the gut has a major role on overall immune status, metabolic status, and intestinal integrity then impacts on systemic integrity. The microbiota is in communication with the brain via both interaction with the gut cellular surface and the production of some of those metabolites in the microbiota, tryptophan, cell signals, neurological signals. So it's not difficult then to understand how, if we give something like a postbiotic that has a direct interaction with that gut microbiota, we can influence that microbiota gut-brain axis. And this gut-brain, this gut axis actually goes even further than just the gut-brain. This is some stuff that was done by Welch et al. And they talk about the role of the rumen, the gut microbiota in the rumen, and the axis with lots of different organs, so the gut organ axis. So we know that the gut has a role to play in terms of the immune system. We know when we talk about the gut that it has a role to play in terms of the lungs, so the respiratory system. And we'll see some data that pertains to that in a short while. The gut other axis is really important. So what we do in the microbiome and the gut can have an influence in terms of udder health and liver health. So whilst I talk about the gut-brain axis being fundamental, it's actually the gut organ axis which is really comes into play when we're talking about the role of postbiotics, for example. So we've introduced the idea of bacterial postbiotics. And we talk about bacterial postbiotics because they give us quite a unique metabolite profile, as we've just mentioned. We can tailor our bacterial postbiotics for whatever solution we're looking to target. But if we just have a look at some of the data in general, then this is some work that was done by Uzzedin et al. Back in 2018. And it's quite a nice piece of work because they took a very controlled in vitro gut model and they used a lactobacillus plantarum, so a lactobacillus as a postbiotic. And what they did within this in vitro model was they fed different levels of this postbiotics from lactobacillus. And what they saw, interestingly, was a linear response, so a straight line response between the total bacteria and the level of postbiotics that they fed. So the more postbiotic they feed, the greater the number of bacteria. Interestingly, not lactobacillus, but what they saw was an influence on the fibrolytic, the cellulitic bacteria. So the Fibrobacter, the Ruminococci, and even the protozoa. So what you saw was as you increase the dose of your postbiotic, you see an increase in the number of fibrolytic, cellulitic bacteria. So those bacteria that are involved with fiber digestibility. What we actually see as well when we feed postbiotics is we see an increase in microbial diversity. And that's always useful, microbial diversity, because it helps with the gut be more resistant to change. Interestingly then, when they looked at the production of volatile fatty acids, then we saw an increase in acetic, propionic, and butyric. So we saw an increase in total volatile fatty acids. Interestingly, no change in pH, despite the increase in the volatile fatty acids. So that's interesting to note, because by feeding these postbiotics, we're altering the volatile fatty acid profile of the rumen. Acetic acid is a key part of driving the growth of cellulitic bacteria. So this feeds quite nicely into the previous slide where we saw an increase in our fibrolytic, our cellulitic bacteria. That's related to the increase in acetic acid that we're seeing here. Then when we begin to really kind of join the dots, when we then look at the gas production, then what we see when we feed our postbiotic is that we see an increase in gas production very quickly. Within the first 3 hours, that difference continues. So gas production is directly, well, not directly, but is a good correlation, a good reflection of in vivo feed digestibility, because as those fibrolytic, as those cellulitic bacteria are breaking down the fibers, they're producing gas. More gas is more fiber production. And what we also see here is the organic matter digestibility significantly increases with our postbiotic inclusion. So when we look at this data, it's telling us that our postbiotic, Lactobacillus plantarum, is increasing the number of cellulitic bacteria, which is a circle increases the amount of total volatile fatty acids, which again drives cellulitic bacteria, which improves feed digestibility. And when we look at that in vivo data, when we move to the field, that's what we see. So this is some work that was done in some pre-calving animals, and this is using a lactobacillus, a combination of lactobacillus and pediococcus species that were given to the animals in feed. And these are data from those kind of cows pre-calving. And what you can see here is they've just got two versions. So PC and PR, the two versions of the lactobacillus pediococcus postbiotic compared to the controls. And when we look at the digestibility here, we can see that we get a significant increase in the digestibility of dry matter and organic matter and NDF. So this absolutely fits with what we just saw previously in our in vitro models using postbiotics, that we actually see that effect in vivo. So we see an improvement in nutrient utilization. And then the authors, when they actually looked at the milk production, then the blue dots here are the control treatment, and the red and the yellow are the postbiotic. So then when we look at the milk production, then we also see an increase in milk production because we have better nutrient utilization, better animal, it's able to produce more milk. So rumen function in terms of microbiota digestibility is one part of the picture. We also have to think about gut integrity. And just a quick recap, when we talk about the gut barrier function, often we're talking about the mucin layer, and we're talking about these tight junctions. So these proteins that hold our intestinal epithelial cells together and act as gatekeepers to compounds, molecules that can move across that membrane. And when we talk about a breakdown of gut integrity, a loss in the gut barrier, often then it's because we've got a breakdown of those tight junction proteins, those cells can move apart. So then we can have the translocation, for example, of bacteria, mycotoxins, endotoxins. So maintaining gut barrier integrity is absolutely crucial, especially, for example, in heat-stressed animals. So in heat-stressed animals, stressed animals, we tend to get a disruption of these tight junctions. And this is some work that was done looking at actually post-weaning lambs, again using a Lactobacillus plantarum. And we can see here, these are tight junction proteins, claudins, occludins. Okay, and what we see when we feed a postbiotic, we get an increase in the expression. So basically, the cells are increasing the expression of tight junction proteins or mRNA that's going to contribute to making those tight junctions. So when we feed a postbiotic, we can increase the expression of tight junction proteins, therefore improve the gut barrier integrity. And lastly, we just look at the role of immunity, because I just want to touch on it. And we could talk for hours on immunity in ruminants, but here we just want to touch on the innate system and the adaptive system. And I want to just focus on one interleukin here, interleukin 8. Okay, and basically this is a little cell signal as part of both the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system, which basically performs a function of stimulating cells to perform phagocytosis, to go after kind of pathogens. Okay, so part of that first line of defense, the cell signals to go and do their job. So when we look at the systemic immunity and the other immunity, it's the same principles. So what this author did, just to show the benefits of postbiotics, they were measuring interleukin 8, so titers, so that marker of cell recruitment in the udder. And what they found is when you give a postbiotic from Lactococcus, whether the organism is alive or killed, you get no difference in the response of IL-8. So the postbiotic recruits, stimulates that cell signal as well as the live microorganism. So just to demonstrate that actually postbiotics, even though they're inactivated, still biologically active. So this is what we see in terms of how our postbiotics work in the ruminant, in terms of their mode of action. But what do we actually see in reality in the field? And here we're just going to touch on Nubiome Boss in dairy production. So Nubiome Boss is some proprietary, comprised up to 13 different proprietary strains of Lactobacillus and Pediococcus. It's produced via a two-stage fermentation, which means that we can enhance the metabolite profile that we see, and it's targeted specifically at ruminants, at dairy animals. It has a complex list of metabolites. We've already touched, for example, on the importance of exopolysaccharides, but basically each of these metabolite groups can have an effect in the animal, whether it's supporting barrier function, whether it's switching IgA classes, acting as an antioxidant, for example. So we've characterized the metabolites in Nubiome Boss, and we know that it works via stimulating the microbiota gut-brain axis. We know that it works via immune regulation, stimulating the microbiota, and via modulating some of those metabolic processes. So when we give Nubiome Boss, within 2 weeks, we can see an improvement in stool quality. And then when we go further and we look at digestibility, what we see, exactly as we saw with some of the other examples of the postbiotics, we see an improvement in dry matter, organic matter, protein, and NDF, excuse me, digestibility. So we have a very visual measure of how postbiotics can improve digestion, can improve stool quality. And that measure is a reflection of, for example, the increased rumination time. So this is some work that we did looking at the rumination in some dairy cows. So we have below the line was the lactation time before Nubiome was introduced. So what we see when you look at where the bulk of the dots are, the propensity of the dots, they're above the red line. So basically, when we feed Nubiome, we get an increase in rumination time. An increase in rumination time is more time for fiber digestion. If we have better fiber digestion, better nutrient utilization, then that means that we can get more nutrients, more energy going in for milk production. And again, similar to the example that we saw in the mode of action, when we looked across some 9 dairy farms, we did some work in Southern Europe, what we see is we looked at milk yield before the implementation of Nubiome Boss, and then we measured milk yield after. And what we saw was a 13.5% average increase in milk production when we used Nubiome Boss. So we see an increase that varied from 3.4 to 38%. But you see consistently an increase in milk production, which fits with how we know postbiotics work. That equates, in this case, to 3.7 kilos per more milk. We know that with New Biome Boss, we have to have probably around 0.5 kilos more milk to break even, which we consistently see. We also see the effect very quickly. If you remember, a key part of postbiotics is the speed of response. And we know that, for example, when we feed New Biome Boss, we see a response in 14 days, as early as 14 days. So these is 8 farms, some work that we did in Eastern Europe. And again, within 14 days of feeding New Biome Boss, we see about a 7% average increase in milk yield. Pretty consistent across every farm. So not only do we see an improvement in production parameters, but you see it very quickly, which again fits because a postbiotic is not relying on colonization to have its effect. The metabolites are delivered where the animal needs them. Immunity is an important part of our discussion. We touched on udder health earlier, and I just want to touch on what we see when we feed New Biome Boss. This is where we were looking at the response to vaccination. So we had some calves that were fed New Biome Boss, and then they were vaccinated, and then we looked at the IgA response to an intranasal vaccination, a vaccination via the nose. And what we saw, while we saw just a small increase in total immunoglobulins, IgG, when we look at the IgA response, so that secretory antibody, we see significantly higher IgA responses in animals that are fed New Biome Boss, in this case, the orange, the NBB. And we also see a significant increase in the antibody titers to BSRV, to the intranasal vaccine. So this tells us that when we're feeding New Biome Boss, we're having an effect on the immune system because we can have an effect on response, for example, to respiratory vaccines. And that's when we look at work we've done in birds, we can see in birds, when we do an autopsy, that we have an increase in number of IgA producing cells in the gut. So again, that fits that by influencing the intestinal tract with New Biome Boss, influencing the immune cells, then we can have an influence on the wider systemic immune system. Excuse me. And then when we actually looked at kind of the inflammatory responses, so how the animal responds to seeing, for example, an E. coli or salmonella challenge, again, when we look at interleukin-1 beta, so just a marker, a measure of inflammation, when we feed New Biome Boss, NBB, we see that we have a significantly lower markers of inflammation. We need inflammation. Inflammation is a good thing, but it needs to be controlled, it needs to be measured. And that's what we see with New Biome Boss. And it's important to highlight that we see this systemic immune response, because what that does is then when we look at wound healing, for example, we get quicker recovery. So if the animal receives damage, for example, here we will look at dehorning scores, then when animals are fed New Biome Boss, they get a lower score, a lower kind of dehorning score, which means that their wounds are healing quicker, which fits with controlled inflammation and managing immune responses. And that's important because when we look at mastitis, for example, we do a longitudinal study on mastitis, what we can see when we feed New Biome Boss over 6 months is we see a 29% decrease in mastitis prevalence. We can see a 33% decrease in new infections and a 33% increase in cure rate. And that fits because we know that we're modulating the immune system, we're modulating the immune system systemically, therefore we can influence other health. We can influence respiratory health, vaccine responses, and other health. And then lastly, just because we're thinking about sustainability, some work that we did in goats, we were looking at the role of Nubia Boss in terms of moderating methane emissions. So we've seen earlier, we know that postbiotics can have an influence on gas production, on rumen microflora. And what we see in this work is when we fed Nubia Boss to goats, we saw a slight decrease in methane produced. But when you actually look at it in terms of methane per kilo of milk, because we improve the productivity of these animals, you actually get a significant reduction in the amount of methane per kilo of milk when you feed a postbiotic. And that's quite important when we think, coming full circle now, to the role of our postbiotics in sustainable production. And we look at the trends in the dairy industry. We know that we have these kind of consumer-driven trends where they're worried about ethical practices. So, concerns around the welfare of our animals. They're concerned about sustainability, so the carbon footprint. As an industry, we've just seen we've got growth. Milk production will grow. So postbiotics can help us meet that production demand because we can improve productivity. Automation is coming in terms of precision farming and so on and so forth. So again, if you can use postbiotics to even out any performance variation, that contributes, that makes it easier to manage from an automation standpoint. And sustainability. And I think this is a nice one, because when we look at all the data we've just looked at, and we look at the sustainability cycle for dairy production, then we know, as we've just seen, that if we can reduce the amount of methane per kilo of milk, we can reduce our greenhouse gases. If we can improve the health and mental well-being of our animals, we're going to have better animal welfare. If we improve feed efficiency, we can actually reduce the amount of crops that potentially we use to feed our animals because we're utilizing them better. If we have better nutrient utilization, we can potentially reduce the amount of nitrogen in our manure. In Europe, we're very concerned, some countries, about the amount of nitrogen that we're putting into the land from agricultural practices. So agriculture, dairy, beef production is under huge pressure. So if we can influence in any way waste management for the good, that's a good thing. If we have reduced input costs, for example, less feed, we have more milk production, we're going to have a better income. So if we have a better income, better animal welfare and better sustainability, that means less regulatory pressure on our farmers. They'll have reduced stress. So we can end up with farmers' health and well-being being improved. And I think when we look at the sustainability angle, this is just some data I found from Brazil. When we look at the targets currently, I think produce, say, 21 million tons of methane. Of that, about 14 million tons comes from cattle and beef, beef and dairy. So if we can improve the digestibility and nutrient capture, then the government has set a target to reduce emissions by 30%, so down to about 11 million tons. So our postbiotics can help meet these sustainability targets by improving the sustainable footprint. So, in the end, to summarize, why do postbiotics matter? Why are we interested in postbiotics? Because they offer a reliable, stable, science-based solution for the modern challenges of livestock production. They're fit for antibiotic-free, low antibiotic usage programs, low emission production. They complement other feed additives much better, for example, than some others out there. They're not dependent on antibiotics. They're not affected by antibiotics. They complement feed management, and they're safe, and they're a low regulatory risk. And when we look at the benefits of postbiotics, we look at the benefits, for example, of Nubian Boss, we see this increased digestive tolerance for variable ingredient quality. We haven't mentioned it, but we can see that you can increase fiber digestion if you or fiber level if you need to. And the postbiotic can help the animal manage that. We have this lower methane, we've discussed it, better fecal quality. You can see improved udder health, so reduced somatic cell counts. Better animals, better milk quality. Again, the data indicates we have improved colostrum quality. We see increased milk production, especially where we have some low quality rations, because the postbiotics are helping with that fiber digestion. As a consequence, we see an improved digestion, improved nutrient use, increased feed intake, which is important in the hot climates. We see improved vaccine responses, and postbiotics, Nubian Boss, is fast acting. You can see responses in fecal quality, milk production in 2 to 3 weeks. So when we talk about Nubian Boss as a specific, unique postbiotic based on proprietary bacterial metabolites, it supports robust immune responses. We see a lower prevalence of mastitis infections, a result of robust immune responses. We see enhanced feed digestion, efficiency, and nutrient utilization. We see increased milk production. And given the challenges that we have in today's production climate, it can be an important tool for sustainability. And thank you very much for your time.
Dave? There?
Hello.
Yeah. Hello. How was to see you in the recorded presentation?
I kept my eyes closed, my ears plugged.
So Dave, first of all, thank you for participating in this session. I know it's late in your home, and I think we have one time for at least 1 or 2 questions. Okay, so I got a question here from Graciela, and the question is, what are the most important criteria to consider when evaluating a postbiotic? Graciela, não sei se era isso, eu tentei traduzir da melhor forma possível. Vamos ver.
Okay, so I guess we ask for clarity when evaluating or when deciding to choose a postbiotic, because there are kind of 2 elements to that question. So I think the first one is when you're selecting a postbiotic, is really very similar to when you choose any other feed additive. You look at kind of the science behind the product that you're selecting, the quality behind it. So for example, when you choose a postbiotic, you can choose an organism that it comes from an organism that's on, for example, the qualified presumption of safety list, or the GRAS. So it's an organism that you know is safe to begin with, same as you would choose a probiotic. So I think, number one is that. I think then it's also looking at what are you trying to target? What is the mode of action, the functionality that you're looking for? And that then feeds into the data you have behind that. And I think it's important to understand the production process behind that postbiotic that you're choosing. So how is it made? How is it manufactured? How is it controlled? So that you have the reproducibility and the consistency of the product.
Ok. Vou tentar traduzir, eu acho que sim. E aí eu tenho a minha amiga Luciana aí para me ajudar. Então, o que eu capturei aqui, assim, ahn, eu não sei, para os que não entenderam, acho que ele falou muito da questão da qualidade, né, de você saber na escolha, quando você escolhe o posbiótico, a qualidade, de onde vem, o que está por trás desse produto. Segundo, ele comentou bastante, ele comentou sobre o que você está buscando em termos de, né, qual que é o seu target que você está buscando em termos de modo de ação e a questão de entender a produção, esse posbiótico é produzido e como ele é fabricado. Luciano, alguma coisa para você adicionar?
Olá, boa noite. Estão me ouvindo? Fábio, tá me ouvindo?
Sim, sim,
Tá.
todo mundo tá.
Não, acho que foi isso, né? No final ele resumiu os pontos, né? Qual é o modo de ação, a funcionalidade que se
Isso.
espera de todos aqueles que ele apresentou, os dados e os resultados em campo, principalmente na realidade de cada fazenda, e o processo de fabricação, e ele disse que realmente a consistência na produção, né, fora o controle de qualidade, é bem importante ao se pensar nos pontos positivos dos probióticos.
É isso aí. Eu estou tentando separar as perguntas aqui. Tem uma outra aqui. Deixa eu ver. A do- Tem duas do Clayton aqui, ou não? Tem uma antes, que é da Tatiana. Falou-se muito sobre a melhora da digestibilidade das fibras com os posbióticos. Um, there is a question here. You have talked about the fiber digestibility improvement with the use of postbiotics. Okay, so
Yep.
the question is, you can notice the increase of the fat rate in this in when you are using postbiotics as well.
Increase the fat. What do you mean by increase the fat rate?
The fat percentage in the milk.
In the milk.
I assume that is the question.
I assume that's the question. We haven't seen a change in when we've used New Bio and Boss. So part of it also depends different postbiotics. So it depends if it's a bacterial postbiotic or a yeast postbiotic. They influence digestibility in slightly different ways. That's how they influence kind of the fiber digesting bacteria. So it's possible. I mean, we haven't. So we certainly, when we fed our postbiotics, we'll see an increase in milk protein, for example. We can see changes in colostrum. We'll see small changes in fat, but we don't see significant. We don't see big changes in butter fat, for example.
Então, Luciana, eu estava lendo outras perguntas aqui. O que eu entendi é que na questão da gordura não se observa muito, observa-se, mas não nada significante. E aí eu queria trazer para a pergunta da Luciana Casemiro aqui, que ela perguntou também sobre sólidos, se havia, além da contagem de células somáticas, se havia algum efeito em sólidos. Ele mencionou alguma coisa de proteína, né? Dá uma ajuda aí. Ou
Isso, ele
posso
fala
pedir para ele repetir?
exatamente.
Paulo.
Ele falou isso, né? Teve um maior ah, aumento da parte de proteína e não tanto quanto da gordura. Mas você talvez possa pedir para ele falar um pouco mais dos outros
And
sólidos.
Dave,
Yes.
can you just reinforce that part that you mentioned about the protein, the all other solids in milk? You mentioned that the fat is we can see any huge increase, but regarding protein or other solid, you can perceive some significant increase or
We
not.
can, but it often actually comes about more when you measure total protein, then we see an increase in total protein because we see an increase in total milk milk yield. So I think the influence in fat often, like I say, can come around how different postbiotics are influencing kind of acetate and butyrate production in kind of in the rumen. And so bacterial postbiotics, like New Biome, for example, typically they work on the rumen function more as kind of a modulator. So more through managing kind of intestinal stress at the cell wall and absorption and so on and so forth. So typically, you know, if we'll see an increase, so we will see an increase in protein, but that's because we see an average increase in
So you
milk
can see
yield.
in absolute numbers, you can see the
Yes.
protein increase, but
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
relatively. In percentage,
Yeah.
you will not notice that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Então, respondendo à pergunta, sólidos, então a proteína, você observa um aumento da proteína porque você tem um aumento da produção. Então, em números absolutos, sim, mas em números relativos você não vai observar um aumento percentual da proteína ou dos sólidos no leite. Não sei se ficou claro. Eu tenho mais uma outra pergunta aqui. Que é, deixa eu ver aqui, que agora eu tenho uma do Clayton. The question, Dave, is how can postbiotics contribute to maintain your action, its action, when you have these nutritional fluctuations in the day-to-day farm activity? I don't know if you can understand.
Yes.
If you have the
Yeah.
fluctuations.
Yeah. And it's a very good question, because as you said, you can have changes in ingredient quality, environment,
Yes.
so all different stressors on the animal. And actually, if you step back and think about it, all those changes are stressors. They're stressors on a, if you like, you could say on a subclinical level, shall we say. So when you feed a postbiotic, such as, and again, I'll talk about bacterial postbiotics to keep it different. Really, what you're doing is you're modulating the animals. Let's say you're modulating homeostasis. Okay. So you are strengthening the gut barrier. Okay. So you're reducing the risk of leaky gut. You're improving the overall immune status. So you're reducing immune stress. You're reducing oxidative stress. So basically, you're helping the animal cope with these kind of peaks and troughs, if you like, of variable feed intake or variable environmental changes that would cause potentially stress on the animal. So ultimately, the animal has a more stable rumen environment, not just the rumen environment, because it's important as well. It's the whole animal. And it's also the hindgut environment. So with a dairy cow, we always focus on the rumen and we forget the rest of it. But like you said, so it's kind of a holistic effect, and it's through modulation, well, not direct metabolic effects, but through modulation of those processes.
Ok. Então, respondendo o que o produto a pergunta é interessante e isso que eu acho que é o grande benefício. Aí eu vou parafrasear e vou responder que esse é o grande benefício talvez do produto, porque ele tem a capacidade de ajudar, de modular a questão da homeostase em todos os sentidos. Então, ele vai reduzir o leak gut que você possa ter, ele vai ajudar na resposta imune, né? Tem alguns, aqui eu que estou colocando, né? Não é fala dele, mas existe alguns estudos sobre a questão do imunometabolismo. Então, produtos que ajudam no metabolismo de vias de respostas, como respostas inflamatórias, anti-inflamatórias, e esse eu acho que é o ponto importante, porque como ele trabalha, como ele comentou, de uma forma holística, ele tende a garantir uma resposta, uma saúde, né? A saúde de uma forma geral, nesse animal que vai estar passando por essas oscilações. Luciana, algum complemento?
Acho que você resumiu bem, né? Ele fala da modulação né? A pergunta foi como mantém a ação. Na verdade, a
Isso.
ação ela é variável conforme as condições dos animais. E ele falou exatamente essa
Ele
questão
age,
da
age em vias,
modulação de todas
isso.
as vias metabólicas, não só no rumen, quanto
Estresse
no intestino,
oxidativos, estresse por
estresse
calor, todas
imunológico,
essas.
como que o animal vai enfrentar todos esses estresses, né? Então, é através dessa modulação holística no animal como um todo.
Tem uma pergunta aqui. ah, uh, One question here is there any difference when in milk production increase and when you have the feed produced directly at the farm compared to the production in the and from feed mill companies? You know what I mean? If you have any, I think
Okay.
it's a mixability probably, but
Yeah, so yeah, okay. So if you have on farm feed mixing, say, versus coming from, so
from
n- yeah, no, if if it's done properly, is the simple answer. As you said, where you run into risks is when you do the on-farm mixing, is if the mixing isn't done very well, etc., then you'll have variability.
I think the matter is the mixability, the mixing.
And
Yeah.
that's the same with any
Yeah.
additive that you're going to put in.
A resposta é não, desde que você faça, garanta uma mistura adequada, seja a mistura que ela é feita comercialmente, uma ração pronta, até uma ração feita dentro da propriedade. O importante é garantir que você tenha uma homogeneidade na mistura, para que você tenha a distribuição adequada do produto nessa ração. Ah, que mais? Tinha uma outra, mais alguma pergunta aqui? A digestibilidade nós perguntamos, o Clayton, posbiótico pode contribuir, foi perguntada. Another question, is there any evidence that about the residual effect when you interrupt the feeding, the product?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So effectively, if I guess the question is if you stop feeding a postbiotic, will you lose the effect? And probably over time, you likely would, because again, we're providing a continuous input of metabolites, so they'll stabilize, as we've just said, they'll stabilize homeostasis, and then if all conditions are good, then in theory, performance could stay elevated if everything on the farm then becomes perfect. But that's not the real world.
Uhum.
So when you take away the support mechanism of postbiotic, the stressors come back in, and we do see that where farmers say, okay, we'll remove, then we'll start to see the decline in milk production, for example, or we'll start to see some digestive issues creep back in.
Então, a resposta seria você pode ter durante um tempo, principalmente porque, como ele falou, que modula a questão da homeostase. Então, se você tem um uso contínuo e fazendo uso contínuo do produto, você vai garantindo que essa homeostase está sob controle, né? Tudo ali operando. Então, não será um cenário ótimo, né? Que você não tenha fatores estressores ou que contribuam para o estresse. Então, talvez você consiga manter essa homeostase. Contudo, né, como ele falou, no mundo real, você tem a questão dos desafios e da pressão e do estresse. Então, aí você pode, talvez, manter por um determinado momento, mas depois, quando essa pressão de estresse ou pressão de infecção, ela surge, o desafio aumenta, você tende a ter uma diminuição dessa homeostase e dessa resposta. Então, obviamente, ele não é um produto que você vai usar por um momento e depois parar, porque ele garantiu que teu animal está na homeostase correta, tudo está modulado. Luciana, algum comentário? Eu tenho uma última pergunta. The question is, obviously, when you're talking about the eubiotic products, right, and programs, is there? We don't think there is one the silver bullet product.
No.
That in eubiotics, and we consider that we needed to combine different eubiotic products in that. And the question is almost that it's possible to combine the Nubion with other feed additives, and probably the answer is yes. And which one of these feed additives you recommend to use or and in association with?
That's a really good question, isn't it? Because I mean, it depends on what you're using and when, for example. So for example, we could talk a transition cow. We're using glucose precursors. I would continue to use glucose precursors, for example, because of that negative energy deficit. But by using a postbiotic, if you just think of how it's working with almost any additive that you're using, you're stabilizing the system. So often, actually, the question comes, well, what could you take out if you use? And again, the question comes if you talk a specific product like New Biome, or we talk bacterial postbiotics in general. So I think typically, if you're using probiotics, let's say bacterial probiotics, the alternative is bacterial postbiotics. It's in my mind, it's a like for like swap, and it's a quicker response. You can also kind of actually, if you're using yeast to stabilize the rumen, if you have a target for ruminal acidosis, then actually a bacterial postbiotic is quite a good fit alongside that as well, because they're working in different ways. Equally, however, if you've got good fiber digestion, if you have everything under control, then potentially you don't need your live yeast in there, because your postbiotic is going to have quite a good stabilizing effect on the rumen in terms of helping with some of those kind of fibrolytic bacteria and stabilizing pH. So, a lot of it depends on what additives you're using and what you're targeting specifically. What we do see with New Biome, and I probably would add in there, it depends on the phase that you're talking about as well, because that's often quite a key thing. So as an example, I probably look at something like New Biome as quite a complement to many programs. So when we're vaccinating, as we saw the data earlier on in the presentation, we know when we feed New Biome, we can stimulate kind of mucosal immunity, so IgM responses. So if you're putting animals through vaccination programs, we have customers that use New Biome within the vaccination programs to help strengthen vaccinal responses, for example. So I think with any feed additive, I'll take it in general, it's very much about when what you're trying to achieve and when. And something like New Biome has a lot of complementarity. So, but there is the potential for removal depending on what you're doing. I hope that answers the question in a very kind of vague round the houses.
No problem. I'll try to summarize that.
Yeah.
Eu vou tentar tornar isso um pouco mais curto. Em resumo, você pode sim combinar com outras alternativas. Ele mencionou levaduras e outras. Vai depender muito de duas coisas: do que você está buscando, qual é o desafio, o que você está buscando e a fase em que você está. E a partir daí entender qual é a complementariedade do Nubion dentro desse cenário em relação ao que você busca. Ele deu um exemplo da questão da vacinação. Então, você, em animais que estão sendo vacinados, o Nubion pode ajudar a produção de imunoglobulinas. Ele comentou de IgM, né? IgG, IgM, e aí você vai ter uma resposta. Então, tem muito desse entendimento, tá? E, por fim, tem uma pergunta aqui que foi feita sobre usar no pré-parto. Sim, ele pode ser usado em diferentes fases. Ele tem protocolos, obviamente, de dosagem, de inclusão diferentes, mas sim, ele pode ser usado no pré-parto, como ele pode ser usado na lactação toda, e até em animais mais jovens ele tem indicação. Eu acho que a gente cobriu bastante perguntas, né? Ele está num horário também bastante avançado lá. Queria agradecer todo mundo que participou aqui. A gente, esse é como eu comentei, um dos primeiros eventos que a gente vai introduzir com a Nuance, com outros parceiros. Então, a gente espera que vocês se tornem participantes assíduos das nossas reuniões. Dave, we are closing the session.
Okay.
Again, I would like to thank you for your time and for your presence and all the materials that you prepare for these sessions. And we hope to see you here in Brazil. I mentioned this before, and we hope to see you here in Brazil soon, because there is a lot of opportunities to visit the field and some dairy farms and have some Brazilian barbecue and some caipirinhas as well. Okay,
I'm sold. I'm sold already, Fabio.
Yeah. So thank you again, and we see you soon.
Thank you for your time.
Pessoal, muito obrigado, e acho que a gente finaliza por aqui, né? A sessão, e agradeço a todos e esperamos para a próxima. A gente deve trabalhar esse material em versões mais curtas, para que vocês possam ter os conteúdos